There we go, Nick. Okay, I used to be pretty confrontational in my youth. As I get older, not quite 30 yet, I'm a lot more soft spoken and I try to avoid conflicts. Would you say this is not respecting myself? I honestly just don't know. The older I get, the more I realize this. No, Nick, okay, well, think about it, man. Confrontation. Why would you be in a confrontation to begin with, right? It's because somebody is pushing their boundaries on you. Now, how do they end up getting into that position to begin with? Like, how is it? Are you gonna, okay. How is it that you're going to be like in a confrontation with somebody unless they have somehow like pushed your boundary, right? They're in your space, they're doing something, they whatever, right? How did it get to that point? That's what I have to ask. Because now all of a sudden you have a confrontation with this person. How did that occur? Like I go through life most of the time, I very rarely ever have any kind of conflict with anybody. Like when I'm in the store, I don't like I don't have any issues with anybody. When I'm dealing like just in society in general, I very rarely ever have a conflict with anybody. But when I do, it's usually because I didn't express my boundaries ahead of time, right? And they were pushing and pushing and pushing, knowing that it might be pushing my boundaries, but because I didn't say anything, they just kept pushing, right? And then eventually I get to the point where I'm like, I've had enough. I can't do this anymore. And they're like, whoa, what's going on, right? And it was because you weren't authentic in the beginning. You were like, oh, fine, whatever, I let it fine. And then pretty soon it's not fine anymore. And then it comes out, and then it comes out unhealthy, right? And a lot of people who have anger issues, it'll come out with, throwing fists and stuff like that instead of just being mad. And that's usually what ends up happening. The older you get, the better you're dealing with that stuff because you've had so many experiences in your life. You just kind of like, prevent it from happening to begin with. But that's really what it comes down to is that I mean, I'm not saying you personally, but most likely it was because there was you not behaving authentically in the early days of whatever it was before the conflict actually happened. And by not being authentic and not saying, hey, I'm not approving of this, I don't want to go forward with this anymore, eventually it got to a point where you just couldn't handle it anymore and then you had a conflict, right? I mean, I'm guessing that's probably the case. And like I said, as you get older, you just kind of learn to navigate that way so you don't run into those issues anymore. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not living authentic. You just learn to navigate, right? You learn to compromise on certain things, or maybe just like, gave up on certain aspects of life, and you're like, well, maybe I just won't pursue that anymore because it's such an issue. It creates such a conflict. And again, it's most likely because either you're not expressing yourself in a real fashion or you're giving out like a manipulative energy, which if you are not acting authentically, if you're not acting, if you are not being authentic and you are actually doing stuff to try and please the other people that are around you so that they will be approving of you, that's manipulation. That is a manipulation tactic, and it's going to eventually fail on you, right? People will eventually figure that out and to say, hey man, that's not you. You're not the real person. You're not the person you were trying to be or whatever. We figured you out. And that's where things start to fall apart. So it's better to just be like true right off the very beginning. And it's just like, hey man, this is me. This is what I got going on. This is the way I speak and what I think and all this other stuff. And if people are approving of it, cool. If they're not, then you're going to have to move on, right? But dancing around trying to figure out what it is that they're going to like about you and behaving that way, you're gonna find yourself completely exhausted and depressed over that. Uh, let's go down here. Thanks for answering my question, Yui. I appreciate your response. Yeah, you bet, Nick. I mean, I hope that helped. I mean, I wasn't trying to be like offensive or anything. I hope you didn't take it that way. It's just just my observation from the question.